Hey, there we go. Hello, friends. Let's see if we've got all the tech working right today. It's very yellow in this room. This is an extremely yellow room. I think everything's working the way it should. Let me know if you can hear me, if you cannot hear me, if something looks weird. I'm broadcasting from a new space. Oh, I just got pen all over myself. I'm broadcasting from a new space this week. So that's always exciting to see if all the tech works and if the internet works and if the sound works and all that good stuff. So let me know if it does. Yay. Hi, everybody. I love how the chat is on a delay. So I like say something and then have to wait a while to see you all respond. So then everybody jumps in at once and I go, oh, there they are. Hi, everybody. Hi, Nikki. Hi, Golden Heart. Hi, Mary. Hi, Robin. Robin, your name, I always have to do the translation for the name. Yay, I'm glad you're here. If you are joining us and you want to interact with the chat and with the Bible study, you can type away. We're happy to have you here. If you just want to sit and listen, that's totally fine too. Yeah, this is our Bible study. And things are kind of things are kind of moving around. In terms of where I am, as has been the case for the past while. And now I just realized I never plugged in my computer. So I'm going to do that. Mary says, how are you doing? I'm doing well. I am doing a lot at once. A lot is happening around here. But I'm doing well. Everything is good. And what did I do today? Today I did some secret stuff for a secret project because I'm going to be that person who has the secret projects that they don't tell you about. But secret projects are kind of fun, right? You get excited about them sometimes? I do. Okay, cool. We're all set. There we go. Sweet. So today we're talking about one of the stories of Jacob in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. It's in Genesis chapter 27 is where we're going to start. And the reason that I picked this story for this week is because I was thinking about a lot of things. I was thinking about gender expression and gender identity, as I usually do. And I was reading a new book from Joy Layden, who wrote a cool book that I'm going to quote from a little bit. So these are all things that have to do with this story. Nikki says, now that your tattoo is healed or healing, do you mind sharing it with us? Yeah, of course. This is my new tattoo. I better stand up to show it to you. This is it. I'm very excited about it. It's the holly and the ivy. This is, if showing it to you upside down isn't going to work so well, but this is ivy and this is holly. And it's an homage to my favorite 17th century English Christmas carol / hymn. So yeah, it's I'm a big fan of it. It looks great. Yeah, Mary says, did you cover up the chakra tattoo? Yeah, I did. It's underneath. You can actually see it through the leaves, which I wanted. You can see it through this big leaf here if it's not on a screen. And I wanted to have it still show through because it's still something that means a lot to me. But I think I've talked a little bit before about it, that it's something that means a lot to me and has to do with my experience of like faith and spirituality, but it's also part of a spiritual tradition that isn't really mine. And so I started to feel a little bit weird about having it because it felt a little bit appropriative at times, even though it was something that like is relevant to my own spiritual journey. Because I'm not Hindu or Buddhist, it felt a little bit weird to have that on me. I felt like it was getting in the way of some of my conversations with people of different faiths. So I decided that I wanted to incorporate it in. So now I can still see it in there, but it's not like the main thing. So that's my tattoo story. Thanks for asking. Right. So Jacob and Esau is what we're talking about today. And Jacob is an interesting character because we talk a lot about stories a lot of stories about Jacob, and he's like got some really great stories, but he's also got some really not great stories. Like Jacob does some messed up stuff in his life. And so he's an interesting character, I think, because he is not 100% perfect and he's not 100% bad. He's yeah, kind of just a human who makes some bad choices. So we're going to read one of these stories. We're going to start in Genesis 27, and I'm going to read verses 1 through 10 to get us started. So we're going to kind of chunk this up into some chunks, and then we're going to stop and talk and ask questions. Yeah, I can see Mary's getting ahead of us here. So let's go ahead. We're going to read Genesis 27. So as usual, if you want to follow along for sure, and read whatever particular tradition or translation you enjoy. And I always love to see the differences in translation. So if I read something that's different from what you read, and there's like a word that jumps out that you're like, wait, this means like a different thing, then definitely throw that in the chat. I would love to see that. Oh, sweet. And hi, Julian, and hi, Living Love. I'm glad you're both there. I didn't see you till just now. So thanks for being here. So let's start. Genesis 27. We're going to read verses 1 through 10. So it starts like this. When Isaac was old and his eyes were dim so that he could not see, he called his elder son Esau and said to him, "My son." And he answered, "Here I am." He said, "See, I am old. I do not know the day of my death. Now then, take your weapons, your quiver, and your bow, and go out to the field and hunt game for me. Then prepare for me savory food such as I like, and bring it to me to eat, so that I may bless you before I die." Now Rebekah was listening when Isaac spoke to his son Esau. So when Esau went to the field to hunt for game and bring it, Rebekah said to her son Jacob, "I heard your father say to your brother Esau, 'Bring me game and prepare for me savory food to eat, that I may bless you before the Lord before I die. Now, therefore, my son, obey my word as I command you. Go to the flock and get me 2 choice kids, so that I may prepare from them savory food for your father, such as he likes. And you shall take it to your father to eat, so that he may bless you before he dies.'" So that's the beginning of this story. We're stopping there at verse 10 because we've got a lot, as they say on the internet, there's a lot to unpack there. So we have to back up and unpack some things. Hi, Kimberly. Yay, glad you're here. So we're going to unpack some things about this Genesis 27 passage. First of all, who are these people that we're talking about? To put this in some perspective, if you remember the story of Abraham, Father Abraham, Abraham and Sarah had a son named Isaac, who's the Isaac that we're talking about in this passage. And then Isaac had 2 twin sons named Jacob and Esau. So you've got Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Esau. So that's the family tree we're kind of working with here. Then you've also got in this story in particular, you have Isaac you have Jacob and Esau's mom, Rebekah. So it's Isaac and Rebekah who have Jacob and Esau. So those are the sort of family structures we're working with here. The family background of this is kind of complicated because Jacob and Esau are twins, and they're born pretty much at the same time, except not quite. Technically, Esau is born first. So Esau is the oldest son in this family, the one that is supposed to inherit all of what Isaac has. Esau is supposed to inherit the blessing and then the birthright, which is like all the material stuff that Isaac has. So the blessing is not the material part. The blessing is God's blessing. So God blesses Abraham, who blesses Isaac, and now Isaac is supposed to pass on that blessing along with all the stuff. So that's what we got going on in this story so far. So when we start this story, we get Isaac calling Esau, the older son. He says, "Come here, Esau." And he says, "I'm going to die soon. So go out and make me some stew, like get some game, make me some stew, bring it here. And I'm going to give you that blessing. I'm going to pass on that blessing, God's blessing to you." And then Rebekah is listening, maybe kind of outside the tent or near the tent. And she hears all this. And so she goes and talks to her son, Jacob. Now, here's part of the problem. Esau is Isaac's favorite son, but Jacob is Rebekah's favorite son. So you've got 2 parents that are kind of playing favorites here when it comes to which kid they like better, which is always a problem in the Bible and in real life. When you have parents playing favorites with kids, that's a recipe for a lot of discord. So that's what you've got going on here. So Rebecca says to Jacob, go out and get a couple of our goats that we have. So you don't have to go very far. They're right here. Go get a couple of my goats, bring them here. I'm going to make your father's favorite food. And then you bring that into your dad. And then you will end up being the one getting the blessing. So that's what's going on in this first part of the story. So we got a little bit of trickery going on here. So first question I've got for you. How do people feel about Rebecca suggesting this plan? Because it's not like it's Jacob's idea right in the beginning. It's Rebecca hearing about the plan and then saying, hey, Jacob, let's do this instead. So how do people feel about Rebecca in this story so far? What's the feeling about her actions and what she's doing? If everybody's a big Rebecca fan, that is okay. You can be a Rebecca fan and still be confused or upset about this story. Golden Heart says, not good. a good summary of the feelings about what Rebecca's doing here. Possibly not good. Does anybody have any thoughts or ideas about why Rebecca might be doing this? Other than just Jacob being her favorite son? Living Love says, no worse than Isaac's not paying attention to the difference between venison and goat. Yeah, so Living Love, you're talking about the food that Isaac eventually ends up getting and not being able to tell the difference in meat. Good point. Robin says, confused. Yeah. I could see Rebecca maybe feeling confused, or you feeling confused about what Rebecca's doing. Both of those things could be true. Mary says, it's still messed up, to be honest. Anita says, maybe she's watching out for herself. She may feel that she will get a better treatment from Jacob than from Esau. Now, that's an interesting point, Anita. I hadn't thought about that. That because women were like considered the property of their husband, and then in some cases the property of their son after their husband dies, it might be that because Rebecca had a closer relationship with Jacob, she was kind of looking out for her own interests and thinking like, well, if my husband's going to die, I want the kid that I get along with who cares about me to take care of me. That could be. We never really hear much about the relationship between Esau and Rebecca. Kimberly says she started the deception in the family. And remember Galatians 6:9, whatever you make happen for another, God will make happen for you. Yeah, so Kimberly, she does kind of start this deception, which is interesting. And that's kind of why I'm bringing it up is like, why? What's going on here? Living Love says neither parent is being great. Yeah, so Kimberly's pointing out this idea of like the golden child, right? The idea that like one of these kids is sort of preferentially treated. So here's what I want to do next. I want to actually take us out of this story and go 2 chapters earlier. I want to rewind a little bit. So if we're thinking about this like a movie, you've just seen this happen, and now we're going to see a flashback to something that happened earlier because it's important in understanding this story. So we are going to flash back to Genesis chapter 25. So 2 chapters earlier. Genesis chapter 25, verses 19 through 28 is what we're going to be looking at. So flip back just a couple chapters, Genesis 25. Yeah, Mary says, I imagine rewinding a VHS tape. Yes, do that. Rewind the VHS tape to Genesis 25. And we're going to read verses 19 through 28 to get a little bit of background on what's going on here. So it goes like this. These are the descendants of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, who was the daughter of Bethuel the Aramean of Pad-aram, sister of Laban the Aramean. Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren, and the Lord granted his prayer, and his wife Rebekah conceived. The children struggled together within her, and she said, if it is to be this way, why do I live? So she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples born of you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other. The elder shall serve the younger. When her time came to give birth, there were twins in her womb. The first came out red, all his body like a hairy mantle, so they named him Esau. Afterward, his brother came out with his hand gripping Esau's heel, so he was named Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. When the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man living in tents. Isaac loved Esau because he was fond of game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. So there's a lot going on here in again in a short amount of time, but this is the origins of this whole story. This is how this all got started. And there's something that I wonder if it kind of jumps out at you all in that question of like why Rebecca had this plan to get Jacob the blessing. This passage helps us understand that a little bit. Can anybody point out why Rebecca might be helping Jacob get the blessing after reading this passage? What does this make sense? Like, what does this tell us or make sense of for us? I love that we get some of Rebecca's backstory here. We actually get more of it farther back you rewind, but I love that Rebecca is like told what's going on and we get to hear some of her feelings about it. Yeah, so Living, Love, and Julian both point out that Rebecca is effectively told by God that the younger is supposed to serve the older. So Rebecca might be acting out of a sense of this is what God wants to happen. She might be doing something tricky because she thinks that's what God wants, which complicates this whole thing. The reason I love this story is because everybody in it has motivations where you're like, I could see a decent motivation for that. Like I could see the good in this. It also seems really bad. Like it's complex, right? Which is why I think it's interesting. Yeah, so Kimberly's kind of pointing to the idea of like predestination, right? This idea that God sort of decides this is what's going to happen and sort of says like, here, Rebecca, this is what's up. This is what she's going to happen. Yeah. So the other thing, well, a couple things about Rebecca. One of the things that a couple people have pointed out in this passage is Rebecca. We can't go too much into Rebecca's backstory, although I kind of would like to at some point. Rebecca is an interesting character in the Genesis stories because even though she's a woman, she takes a lot of initiative. She is kind of in control of stuff in a way that you don't often see with women in these Genesis stories. Most of the time, things are just sort of happening to them. But for Rebecca makes stuff happen. She's very, she puts herself out there. And there are a lot of times when it seems like between her and Isaac, this married couple, it seems like Rebecca, in sort of the gender normative language, she wears the pants in the relationship, which is something that is interesting to see in these stories. So people have pointed out that in this story, Rebecca herself does not actually ask to get pregnant. It's Isaac who asks on behalf of Rebecca. So it's in verse 21, it says, Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren, and the Lord granted his prayer, and his wife Rebecca conceived. This idea that Isaac was like, we got to have kids, we for sure do. And the fact that Rebecca may not have been psyched about that idea. People kind of put that together and see Rebecca as a bit of a gender nonconformer in a lot of ways. So Mary says, does Rebecca even want kids? It kind of doesn't seem like it. It kind of doesn't seem like this is something that she actually wants. And so when she does get pregnant, she has these twins, and it says the children struggled within her. So she's probably having a lot of pain. So like this could just be the language telling us what Isaac does, and then Rebecca having a very normal reaction to having like pains while pregnant. It could just be like any 9-month pregnant person that you ask is going to tell you that it feels terrible at that point. So maybe this is just like normal frustrations, but maybe Rebecca didn't want to be pregnant in the first place. And then when she does get pregnant, she's like, if it's going to be like this, why do I even live? And so when she goes to God to ask about it, God says, here's this prophecy, right? So I like to kind of just put a lens on Rebecca for a second because she's such an interesting character. And there's so much going on with her throughout the different stories. But I don't want us to forget that it may have been that Rebecca was not into this whole having children plan in the first place. So when she does have the boys, the first one comes out red, and they name him Esau because that means red. His body is hairy. And then she has Jacob, and Jacob is gripping Esau's heel. So Jacob is named it's sort of translated as like one who grips the heel or one who follows, but it's also a word. They use the word supplanter, so somebody who takes somebody else's place. So those are sort of the reasons behind the names of these two boys. And then at the end, verse 27 and 28, we get this description of the boys as they're growing up. Esau is a skillful hunter, a man of the field, but Jacob was a quiet man living in tents. Now, those are like gendered things. Those are not like, those are gendered ways of describing people. Esau is a man's man. He's like out there, he's hunting. He's like imagine like tall, super hairy dude in camo with guns. Like that's Esau. And there's a lot of associations. Like none of those things are inherently masculine, but we have ideas that they're masculine, right? This idea of like being more hairy, being bigger, hunting. Like we have ideas about that as masculine. So Esau is fulfilling these masculine ideals. On the other hand, we have Jacob, who's quieter and lives in tents. So Jacob is sort of an inside guy. And to say that he lives in tents is not necessarily to say, because like everybody lives in tents, but the idea is that he's kind of a homebody, and he kind of like in today's sort of parlance, you'd essentially call him a mama's boy, right? He was a kid who stuck around his mom and around women as they were doing their things. And so even this description of these two boys is very gendered kind of from the beginning. And then the last thing, which so verse 28, I find this really interesting. It says, Isaac loved Esau because he was fond of game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. The thing I think that's weird about that is that it seems like Isaac loves his son Esau for what Esau can do and like what Esau can do for him. Like Isaac seems to be loving Esau not because of who he is, but of what he can do and what he can provide. Whereas it seems like Rebekah is loving Jacob, period, like just because of who he is. And so I find that interesting because it makes me think about the other times where like in cases where people are loved for what they can do and not for who they are, that can set somebody up for sort of a crisis of like personhood. So I feel for Esau a little bit, because I wonder sometimes if Esau felt like if he couldn't live up to his dad's like hunting standards, that he wouldn't be loved anymore, you know? Like maybe Esau felt like he had to do these certain things to earn his dad's love and not just be loved for who he is. So I kind of have a soft spot for Esau because that sucks. Okay, so we're gonna go. Now that we've kind of got this background, we are going to flip flop back over to Genesis 27. So flip those pages, rewind the tape forward again. We're gonna go back to Genesis 27. So we're in the middle of this scene, right, where Rebekah has said to Jacob, "Okay, go get these goats. I'm gonna prepare them. You're gonna go in and pretend to be your brother." So that's what we've got going on here so far. We are going to read verses 11 through 20 next. So chapter 27, verses 11 through 20. So Rebekah has just said, bring this food in. It'll be great. Jacob said to his mother, Rebekah, look, my brother Esau is a hairy man, and I am a man of smooth skin. Perhaps my father will feel me, and I shall seem to be mocking him, and I will bring a curse on myself and not a blessing. His mother said to him, let your curse be on me, my son. Only obey my word and go get them for me. So he went and got them and brought them to his mother, and his mother prepared savory food such as his father loved. Then Rebekah took the best garments of her elder son Esau, which were with her in the house, and put them on her younger son Jacob. And she put the skins of the kids on his hands and on the smooth part of his neck. Then she handed the savory food and the bread she had prepared to her son Jacob. So he went into his father, and he said, my father. And he said, here I am. Who are you, my son? Jacob said to his father, I am Esau, your firstborn. I have done as you told me. Now sit up and eat of my game so that you may bless me. So that's the next chunk in our story here is Jacob getting ready, getting all dressed up, and bringing in the stew to his dad. So I wonder if there's a difference for you all in Jacob's actions in the first part of this story, in the first chunk we read versus in the second chunk. Are you feeling sort of sympathetic towards Jacob? Do you think he's doing the right thing? Do you think he's doing the wrong thing? What do you think Jacob is doing right now? We kind of had some like feelings about Rebecca before, but now I want some feelings about Jacob. How are people feeling about him? I'm going to tell you, at least for my part, that for me, there seems to be a line that Jacob crosses in the second bit of the passage. And that's where I feel like I lose Jacob. I jump off the Jacob bandwagon. But I want to see if you all have those same feelings or different ones. Robin says it's kind of shady. Living Love says he might have been reluctant at first, but then he accepts it fully by lying. Kimberly says, in the non-spiritual sense, it's evil and deceptive. Makes me nauseous because I've been through this personally with my brother Jacob. Oh no, Kimberly. That's rough. So you've got like a real brother Jacob. So this is hitting close to home for you probably. Robin says he flat out lies. And says devious. Yeah, so I think people are, who was it? Was it Living Love? Yeah, Living Love, I think, said specifically that bit that is kind of where the line is for me. And that's the bit where Jacob straight up lies about who he is. And so like we've got in Genesis 27, he kind of he expresses that reluctance where he says to his mom, like, what if my father figures out who I am and he curses me instead of blesses me? And then Rebecca says, I'll take the curse if it happens, but obey my word. So all of the Jacob like getting dressed and getting ready to go and taking the food in, all of that, I feel like I can kind of be like, well, he's supposed to obey his mom. So like he's kind of doing the right thing. I can kind of be on board there for a little bit. But the point where I like kind of jump off the Jacob bandwagon is that moment where Isaac says, who are you? And Jacob says, I'm Esau, your firstborn. Like that sort of flat out lying. I'm like, okay, I know this is what your mom told you to do. So technically you're still obeying your mom, which is a good thing, but you're flat out lying, which is a bad thing. So like that's this tension, right? It's this tension. So Living Love says, these are not loving behaviors between people. How are these godly role models? Living Love, that is a great question. And the answer to the question is they're not supposed to be 100% role models all the time. People in the Hebrew scriptures in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, but we have less narrative there. We're supposed to be given these pictures of people as like fully human, people that screw up and are forgiven and who God loves anyways. And in fact, you can argue that it's more important that God chooses and continually loves and works with people that screw up all the time, because that's good news for us, right? So if God only chose and worked with perfect people, we might be kind of screwed. So in general, I think that's a good thing. But I don't think these people are meant to be role models all the time. I think these are people that are meant to, they have stories and they teach us lessons, but sometimes it's more complicated than just a good role model. Anita points out the men in the story seem to be unable to actually act for themselves, but rather have to be directed. That's true. So just like we had Rebecca sort of directing things earlier, well, we still kind of have Rebecca directing things, right? It's an interesting thing where the men are kind of pushed into action by Rebecca specifically. Yes. Okay. So I want to make sure that we can get through all this. So what was the last thing I was going to say about that? Oh, one thing that I think is really interesting is oh wait, that's not till the next verse. Okay, I'm gonna hold down on that. I'm gonna hold down on that question. Okay, wait a second. Golden Heart says, yeah, that's the one thing they don't teach you in Bible school. Yeah, the fact that they're just people. Yeah, right. I think we learn these stories, especially in Sunday school or Bible school, and it seems like, oh, these are like the ancestors of the faith. They're the great role models. And it's like, well, most of the time they screw up. And that's important. I think it's important to be able to show kids like stories like this one, like with Jacob and Esau and the rivalry between brothers. And like there's a lot in here that even little kids are going to go like, oh yeah, I know how that feels, right? So I feel like, and this is going to be something we're going to talk about kind of toward the end of the stream, but I feel like Jacob in this story, not always, but in this story, I think Jacob is supposed to not be the role model. He's supposed to be the cautionary tale. He's supposed to be telling us what we're not really supposed to be doing. But if he didn't do what he did, we wouldn't have the stories that we do because important things happen later. So you just never know. Okay, cool. So let's move to Isaac, I'm Esau, your firstborn. Okay, cool. So let's read. We're going to read the end of this bit of the story. So verses 21 through 27. And then we're going to stop at Isaac's blessing. So starting in verse 20 here. But Isaac said to his son, "How is it that you have found it so quickly, my son?" That is the game to make the food. Jacob answered, "Because the Lord your God granted me success." Then Isaac said to Jacob, "Come near that I may feel you, my son, to know whether you really are my son Esau or not." So Jacob went up to his father Isaac, who felt him and said, "The voice is Jacob's voice, but the hands are the hands of Esau." He did not recognize him because his hands were hairy like his brother Esau's hands, so he blessed him. He said, "Are you really my son Esau?" And he answered, "I am." Then he said, "Bring it to me that I may eat of my son's game and bless you." So he brought it to him and he ate, and he brought him wine and he drank. Then his father Isaac said to him, "Come near and kiss me, my son." So he came near and kissed him, and he smelled the smell of his garments and blessed him. So that's where we're going to stop there. So what do you all notice in this last bit of the story? Is there anything that jumps out to you? Any feelings or thoughts that you have about this last bit of the story? Mary says, "Reminds me I got to go eat." That's fair. I hope you get some good goat meat stew. I think it was Living Love who pointed out earlier that it's kind of funny that Isaac can't tell the difference between like wild game stew and like raised goat meat stew. Which like I wouldn't be able to tell the difference personally, but if you only ate wild game and goat and sheep, you'd probably be able to tell the difference. Yeah, so Living Love says, "Just a lot more deception. It's disheartening." Yeah. Kimberly says, "It reminds me, don't deceive your parents or siblings or sell something that only God can give." Yeah, so I think it's this sense of like that last point, Kimberly, that you can't give away something only God can give is, I think, a really interesting thing to bring up in this story, because this sort of birthright and blessing that Isaac is passing down is supposed to be like given to him to give to somebody else. But also, like, we know that if God is not down with a specific person, God could easily have taken this blessing away and could have done something else with it, right? So it's interesting that things play out this way and that God doesn't seem to intervene. Julian says, "Isaac knows that it's Jacob and goes along with it." Yeah, so that's another interesting possibility, Julian, is that Isaac does know what's going on here and plays along, which would be a really interesting twist, right? That Isaac maybe knew what was happening, where he says like the voice is Jacob's but the hands are Esau's, and then he's really suspicious, right? One of the questions that I kind of asked myself reading this is, why the heck is Isaac so suspicious? He feels like something is amiss, right? And it kind of makes me wonder if maybe Isaac and or maybe Esau and Jacob have been playing tricks like this a lot in their lives. Like, it kind of makes me wonder if these are a couple of twin pranksters, or Jacob is the twin prankster who pulls stuff like this a lot. Like, maybe that's why Isaac is so suspicious. But yeah, maybe he's just going along with it, which would be really weird. But could be. Robin says, "Maybe Isaac's taste goes with his sight." Yeah, so interesting. Two things about that. One, it's possible that Isaac is really, really old and that he literally has lost his sense of taste. Like, my great-grandfather, we lived with him when I was a kid. My great-grandfather lived till he was 98, and he definitely at the end was like, "Well, I just can't taste anything anymore." So maybe he really was losing his taste as well. But I think that brings up something cool, which is thinking about the way that the senses are at work in this passage. You have sight going on with being able to see or not see. You have touch going on with how hairy or smooth Jacob or Esau is, right? You've got taste going on with the stew. You've got smell right at the end there. It says he came near him and smelled his garments, right? So you've got smell happening. What else am I missing? Hearing. And then where he said this is the voice of Jacob, but the hands of Esau, right? So the five senses are all at play in this story. And I find that super cool because it makes it feel like a fully fleshed out story. Like all of the senses are being invoked here in this story in a way that feels like it doesn't happen that often. Usually you just get like something smell or taste or touch, but you don't get all five senses interacting in a story like this very often. And so I think it's really interesting. Living Love says all the physical senses, but none of the spiritual senses. Yeah, I think another way that maybe I would put that is there's a lot of physical senses going on, but there doesn't seem to be any emotional intelligence here between Jacob and Isaac. There doesn't seem to be a lot of emotional intelligence or like a way to really know who somebody is, right? Like if Isaac is relying entirely on the five senses to tell him which kid this is, he might not actually know his kids very well. Like, he should be able to know them better than having to rely on his five senses to tell which kid it is. Yeah, so what was let me think here. Yeah. So I think the thing that just kind of like strikes me in general about this interaction between Isaac and Jacob is that sense of like not really knowing who the person is standing in front of you. And especially like Isaac not really seeming to know Jacob either. So that kind of it stands out to me as kind of a sad moment. Like there's a lot about this story that feels sad to me. But that is one of the ones that feels like most sad. Goldenheart said, "Is this story a part of history in the Bible?" Yeah. So, like, do you mean is it a part of like the historical narrative? Yeah, it totally is. It's the sort of most important stories that we get in the Bible in sort of the history portions is we get this long line that goes from it goes from Adam and Eve to like Noah to like Abraham and then Isaac and then Jacob. And then later on, you end up with King David, who kind of comes later. So it's kind of this long history of all these families that kind of go one through the other. So this is in the Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob section of Genesis is like central. So Robin says, I have heard some detractors use this story to say how God doesn't love all people. Interesting, Robin. Can you say some more about that? I don't think I understand how people would use it to say that. So tell us more about that because I'd be interested to know. So, let's see. I think I'm going to read this bit from Joy Layden's book about this story because I think that kind of connects it to gender, and I want to connect this to gender later. Oh, I see. Robin is saying that people have used it to say that God hated Esau. Yeah, now that I think about it, I have heard that kind of thing too. This idea that like God didn't want Esau to inherit and God didn't really love Esau. But the thing about it is Esau, like Jacob does way more terrible things in his life than Esau does. Esau seems to be kind of a dummy, but he's not a bad guy. And so it seems strange to me that people try to use this story to say that God hates some people or like, because God doesn't do anything bad to Esau. And in fact, later on in these stories, after Jacob apologizes and realizes how he's essentially ruined Esau's life, they come back together and they make up, and like Esau is seen as good. So I have a hard time with people that would try to use the story that way because it doesn't seem to really play out in the rest of the narrative. So I want to read this bit from Joy Layden. So this is a new book that came out by Joy called Reading God and Torah, The Soul of the Stranger. So Joy is a Jewish trans woman. And of course, Jews and Christians have this bit, the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, we have these stories in common. So there are a lot of times when I will look to Jewish folks and they're writing about these stories because they often have a different perspective than I do as a Christian. And Joy, as a trans woman, can see a lot of cool things in this that also I can't see. So I want to read you a little bit of her experience with this story and the way that she understands it. So Joy says, so she gives us a little background. She says, Jacob and Esau are both male and are born almost simultaneously, but they are assigned at birth very different gender roles. Because Esau emerges from the womb first, he is considered the firstborn heir, not only to Isaac's worldly possessions, but also to the relationship with God that Isaac inherited from Abraham. Though Jacob is born holding on to his brother's heel, he's considered the secondborn, expecting to accept the authority of his older brother, who after their father's death will become the head of the family. Like the gender binary, male and female, this law of inheritance, called primogeniture, creates a lifelong determining binary division between males who are and who aren't the firstborn. So Joy's saying, just like we have male and female binary, in ancient times, in the times of this story, you had firstborn and not firstborn, and that was almost another kind of binary. Like the gender binary, primogeniture turns biology, in this case birth order, into destiny. The way male children are raised, the roles they're assigned, and the futures which they are steered toward are determined by whether they are or aren't firstborn sons. Before Jacob dresses up as his brother, the Torah describes them not only as different kinds of men, firstborn and secondborn, but also as binary opposites. Jacob is smooth, Esau is hairy. Jacob is domestic, Esau is a hunter. Jacob is close to his mother, Esau is close to his father. Though they are both male and both men, Jacob is portrayed as feminine, at least compared to the hyper-masculine Esau. They live different kinds of lives, wear different kinds of clothes, do different kinds of work, bond with different parents. Just as the differences the gender binary attributes to men and women have little to do with physical sex, none of these differences between Jacob and Esau has anything to do with inheritance or birth order. Even so, the Torah presents them as though they were the natural consequences of the gender roles they were assigned at birth, as unchangeable as the order in which they were born. Even before Esau and Jacob are born, God tells their mother Rebekah that they will not ultimately be defined by the roles that they are assigned at birth. So this is why I'm going to stop there for a second. This is why Joy thinks that these two characters are so interesting from a trans perspective, is because she sees Jacob and Esau as being assigned roles, this sort of firstborn and secondborn, and seeing the binary between them. And yet Jacob doesn't accept that role. This idea that they will not ultimately be defined by the roles they're assigned at birth is why Joy thinks that this story is so relevant to trans folks. So now we're going to get a little bit deeper into this comparison. And of course, it gets tricky, right? Because who wants to compare themselves to Jacob in a moment where Jacob is doing a really crappy thing? So that's why we gotta think hard about this. So let me take a drink and I'm going to read this next bit here. Isn't Joy wonderful? Isn't this so good? Okay, so Joy says, if God were committed to the gender binary ideal, that people are unchangeably defined by the roles they're assigned at birth, then either Esau would have been destined to inherit Isaac's relationship with God, or Jacob would have been born first. But as God reveals to Rebekah before the twins are born, God intends for the younger brother to usurp the elder, prenatally linking God's blessing to this trans experience. So that idea that God doesn't appear to be super into the idea of an assigned at birth binary. God kind of has other plans sometimes, which is cool. Okay, so here's Joy talking about her experience. Just as okay, wait a second. I should stop for a minute. I should stop for a minute to say that Joy, for herself, uses the word transsexual for herself. And not all trans people like the word transsexual. There's some connotations about like people who have medically transitioned versus those who haven't. So I would say that if you are not a trans person, I would not use the word transsexual. But if a person identifies as transsexual, that's totally fine. That can be their word. So I just wanted to give that as a prelude to what Joy says here. Joy says, just as I and many transsexuals have felt, Jacob fears that his body will betray his gender presentation. He tells his mother, "My brother Esau is a hairy man, and I am smooth-skinned. If my father touches me, I shall seem to him as a trickster and bring upon myself a curse, not a blessing." Jacob fears that no matter how he presents himself, his father will recognize him for what he is, a trickster who deceptively uses signs of masculinity to prevent his father from identifying him with the body and gender role he was born to. Transsexuals are often seen by others as tricksters, and in fact, my gender therapist gave me a letter to carry assuring police and other authorities that I was not presenting myself as a woman in order to commit fraud. But transsexuals present ourselves as a different gender than the one we were assigned at birth to reveal, not to conceal, who we truly are. Jacob really is committing fraud, trying to pass as someone he knows he isn't to steal something that isn't his. Even though I knew that Jacob was not a transsexual when I read this story as a child, I saw it as a story about one of the most painful aspects of my own experience. Jacob and I were both pretending to be sons we knew we weren't, hoping our parents wouldn't recognize the truth hidden beneath our clothes and skins. Like Jacob's, my life depended on clothing myself in a phony masculinity in order to receive my family's blessings of food, shelter, clothing, and love. And like Jacob, I was terrified of the curse I was certain would come if my deception was discovered. When Jacob purchases Esau's birthright, it seems that only he and his brother are aware of how Jacob's position has changed. But when Jacob steals the blessing, he not only temporarily passes his firstborn brother, he publicly and permanently transforms his gender role, assuring that everyone, even his father, recognizes he is no longer the man he was born to be. Although he is still Isaac's secondborn, subject to the authority of his older brother, he is now endowed with a firstborn's material and spiritual inheritance. In this sense, perhaps we can read Jacob as a transgender person, someone who must abandon the gender role he was assigned at birth in order to become the person who, as God's prophecy to Rebekah tells us, he was created to be. So, that's all I wanted to read from that. But I love the way that Joy points out how Jacob's story both does and doesn't connect to trans people today. She says, it's not the same because Jacob was trying to present himself as somebody he wasn't, and trans people are trying to just be themselves. So that's why it's different. But it's the same in that Jacob was trying to clothe himself in this mask of gender to try to get these things that he thought he needed or thought that he wanted, right? I think it's especially important, the sentence where Joy says, like Jacob, my life depended on clothing myself in a phony masculinity in order to receive my family's blessings of food, shelter, clothing, and love. This idea of the masks that we wear because we have to in some cases, right? Like for a lot of us, before we're able to come out, we have to fit these gender roles that were sort of handed to us that don't fit because we need to live in a house and we need our parents to protect us and feed us, right? Like there are times when wearing a mask, it still feels like it sucks, but sometimes it might be necessary for your survival, right? But I think the point where it crosses over, kind of like almost like that point where it was like I was on the Jacob train until I had to jump off when he was lying. I think the point where it changes is the point at which we're still wearing the gender masks that we've been given just so that we can gain more stuff, more power, or more prestige or whatever. I think that's the point at which we have to think about jumping off the bandwagon and taking the mask off. If it's no longer a survival thing and we're just using it to get things that we want, that's usually the point at which we're like, it's not worth it anymore. Yeah. So I think I really like how Joy kind of points that out, the ways that it does match and the ways that it doesn't match, right? And says, yet another example of subversion of the normative in the Bible. Yeah, it's true. Stories like this happen all the time in the Bible, which is why it's so interesting, right? So I think I think that was pretty much everything that I wanted to make sure we included. I think, again, it's sort of it's important to recognize that this story specifically, I'll speak about this story specifically, the people in this story are not meant to be models that we follow because they're so good. And I'm really glad that I can't remember who brought it up. I think it was Kimberly who brought it up earlier, that it's not meant to be a story about people who are supposed to emulate because they're good. It's a story about human beings making human decisions. And that's not always great. But I think that there is a lot that we can learn from these people. And I think we've talked a lot about sort of Jacob and Esau. But I think there's a lot we can learn from Rebecca too. I'm hoping that we can sort of dive more into some of her early stories, because she's got some early stories that are really cool as well. But yeah, I don't think we should hold these people up as like the role models. But I think it's interesting to notice that kind of what Anne was saying, that subversion, right? And the ways that that gender lines are being crossed, even when they're not gender lines that we think about. Like, we don't really care at this point who's the oldest kid anymore, but that was a really big dividing line in these days. Golden Heart says, is it okay to lie to protect yourself? Because I have mixed feelings on that. I think that's exactly like kind of what I was talking about when I was talking about like the masks that we wear to survive. I think it's hard, right? it's I think that there are actually I'm gonna launch myself back for a minute to the sermon that I preached on Sunday. I preached a sermon on Sunday about Jesus talking about how none of the commandments none of the commandments will be lost, or anything, that Jesus is showing up to fulfill the commandments and not to get rid of them. And so I was preaching about the commandments and how we understand which commandments are important. And I think it's important to remember that the commandments, God gave people commandments so that we may live. There are so many times in the Bible when we are told that God's commandments are for us to live fully. And if you are in a place where you have to choose between, like, say, breaking the commandment to not lie or dying, I think there are times when you have to choose to live, and that's okay. It's complicated when there are other people involved, right? When you have to choose between the survival of yourself or other people, that makes it way more complicated. But if it's a situation where, for instance, you are a trans person who is a minor, you're 16 years old and you're trans, and you really want to come out because you want to be honest about who you are and you don't want to lie. But you're a minor and you're dependent on your parents for food and clothing and shelter. I don't think that there's anything wrong with not coming out in that case. I think there are times when survival has to sort of override some other things. Not all other things, not damage to other people, but there are times when safety has to come first, because above all, I think God wants us Jesus said that he came that we might have life abundantly, right? And so I don't think that that not coming out to save yourself is a bad thing. But that's just my personal opinion. So I think that's something that you might have to decide for yourself. But I think that there are definitely times when protecting yourself is okay. And definitely in the case of coming out, you should never have to come out or feel like you need to come out before it's safe for you to do so. Yeah, so Kimberly and Robin are both pointing out that there's a time and a season for all things. So sometimes there's a season to stay safe, and sometimes there's a season to come out, and that might not quite be your season yet, but I know it will come eventually. So you don't have to be worried about doing it too fast. So that's all I had for this Bible study session. And thank you all for showing up and being here. This was a really fun conversation. It's funny how these Bible studies are so much different from in-person Bible studies. I was leading a couple other Bible studies this past week, and with Bible studies where I'm sitting around with a group of people, I ask way more questions because I'm like talking with them, and like there's not the delay. So when I'm on video with you all, I ask fewer questions just because I don't want to worry too much about the delay. But I really appreciate when you all are answering and coming up with good stuff and good questions back. So thank you for being involved. It's really fun. Yes, good. More conversation about lying and whether or not it's okay in certain situations. It's tough. It's tough. I'm glad you're all talking about it. Yeah. Anne says, even Jesus didn't reveal his true self to his disciples until the right time. True. All right. So that's where we're going to end tonight. Thank you all for being here. The next Bible study is going to be on the 24th, February 24th. So 2 weeks from tonight, we're going to have our next Bible study. Haven't decided what it's going to be on yet. Maybe we'll go back and talk about Rebecca. I don't know. If you want to hear more about Rebecca, put a comment in the video after it's posted, because that will be helpful for me in deciding what to talk about next. Otherwise, we will see you all in just a couple of weeks. Next week, if you want to hang out, next Monday night, we'll have our usual support group, video support group for any gender expansive folks who want to be involved. If you want to be involved with that, you go to bit.ly/trans Christian support. And that's each of those words are capitalized. So trans Christian support. And then you will be able to sign up for that, which is always a really fun time. So thanks for being here, everybody. And we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Peace.